Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now take your questions from the floor. There are microphones that will be available. Can I remind you once again that this session is being both filmed and taped, so be aware of that as you make your question, and also speak up so that we can all hear. Can I take the first question from the floor? This gentleman right in the middle there. Thank you. There's a... Thank you very much.
Right now, the leader of Iran is meeting with the leader of Russia and China to discuss what I believe might be some sort of new economic model for their part of the world. Of course, we don't know the outcome of this yet, but I address my problem to Saul to see this as a possibility, remembering Russia has threatened to turn off the gas pipeline of energy to Europe. Iran is flexing its muscles still, and we don't quite know where China might go with this new alliance.
Good. Thank you very much. Saul, any comment on that?
Well, my impression was that the leaders of Iran had one or two other things
on their minds
at the moment. And what I think Mr. Last might be referring to was the meeting that occurred earlier this week in Yekaterinburg, which we remember as being the place where the Romanovs were killed by the communists, among other things, in 1918. But there was a meeting in Yekaterinburg of the presidents or leaders of China, Russia, Brazil and India to discuss potential changes to the international financial system. And China in particular, with the support of Russia, Brazil and India have had less to say about this because I guess they have less at stake, have expressed concern about the risks they face as a result of the large number of US dollars they hold in their foreign exchange reserves. China, as I mentioned, nearly $2 trillion US dollars worth, not all of it in dollars, but the bulk of it. And China with, I think at last account, Russia at last account with close to 500 billion, most of it in US dollars. Both of them are therefore at risk of some loss if the dollar were to fall. Both of them as having aspirations to displace the role of the United States as sort of orchestrator of what goes on in the international financial system, anxious to see the dollar knocked off its peg, because there are certain attractions and advantages that accrue to having your currency as the world's reserve currency. Among other things, you don't run currency risk when you trade because it's in your currency. You can borrow from the rest of the world and make your creditors take the currency risk rather than taking it on yourself as you normally do if you borrow in someone else's currency. And there are some other advantages as well that add up to what General de Gaulle famously called an exorbitant privilege. So I think what those countries are on about is exploring ways of, if you like, taking advantage of the current relative weakness of the United States to weaken the role of the US dollar in the international financial system. And while specifically the governor of the People's Bank of China has not proposed his own currency as a reserve, and the yuan does not at this stage meet most of the criteria required for a currency to be a reserve currency, nonetheless to position the SDR as an alternative. Now, as I say, in practice I don't think that will work. But what they're doing is laying the basis for cooperation among themselves as rising powers in the international economic arena, with a view over the longer term to probably speeding the evolution of a world in which, just as there are multiple sources of economic and political power, so there will be more than one currency used in international commerce and finance.
Thank you very much, Saul. There's a question just there, the gentleman. Thank you. Oh, I beg your pardon. You're right in my line of sight, but I'll catch you.
Ken Burbridge.
Yeah.
China during both the Cultural Revolution and Tiananmen Square. A quarter of a century ago, the highest official ever outside of Beijing in Canberra was Jiao Ziyang. He made a statement that in respect to developing countries, they will not develop while the current financial order is held by the developed countries. My question is, how much will his pragmatic insight be revealed from his grave? In other words, how much will China make of changing the whole global financial situation?
Mark, would you like to have a go at that?
As I mentioned, the institutions that we have today were built in 1950 when Europe and the US were half of the global economy and 30% of the global population. And there's no doubt that those numbers will be very much lower than that by 2050. What role has let's say the IMF played in the current financial crisis, in the Asian financial crisis, and in other sort of global crises in the past decade or so? I think it's debatable whether the IMF has been a culprit or not in these crises. In the Asian crisis, I think there's little doubt that the IMF solutions that were proposed in late 1997 and 1998 were the wrong solutions for the crisis. But remember, the Thai Central Bank rang the IMF up on July the 1st in the evening and said, we're going to run out of money tomorrow. Can you give us a hand? They didn't have a lot of time to think about how to solve this problem. So the initial policy response was the traditional policy response that they required them to tighten monetary policy, to tighten their budget and so on. I think as the crisis became better understood, they were a lot more pragmatic in their approach. They encouraged lenders to roll over loans rather than to withdraw funds, which exacerbated the falls in the exchange rate. And I think it's not the case that they were on US banks or US mutual funds side or Western entities' sides on this one. They were very much trying to help out, I think, the Asian economies. They just got it wrong initially. In the current global financial crisis, as a result of that, there was a big debate about the nature of the global financial architecture and whether it needed to be changed. The problem is I don't think countries agree. There is not a Western and an Eastern or a Western and a developing country view particularly on this. I think China has a banking system, for example, that is regulated in a very different way to Australia, but the banking institutions in China are as stable as Australia's for different reasons. We have a lot more regulation, probably not as much as China, but we borrowed our regulatory system from Canada. It looks very different to the United States. The Europeans are different again. So the global financial architecture, I think, is very different from country to country. It's regulated in very different ways. And the role of the IMF as the sort of global overseer of this is, I think, probably been overstated in terms of their responsibility for, let's say, keeping poor countries down, as Zhao Ziyang, I guess, was implying. And probably on the flip side, they're not as responsible or not as able to push the global economy along in the current environment.
Thank you. There was one, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Hans Baer, an anthropologist in development studies, and I'm starting to feel like I'm a gadfly at this festival because I've asked so many questions.
Oh, that's good. Ask another one.
But at any rate, I'm not a China expert, but I have been to China, and what I saw in China over the course of 3 weeks struck me as an environmental disaster. And it almost seemed to me, as an anthropologist, that China was sort of picking up some of the worst mistakes of the West. And it seems to me that China has picked up on this idea of just ongoing economic growth, which basically is the premise of most economists. And I think it's perhaps time in a festival of ideas to think about other models, models in which we look at a world where we have greater social equality instead of increasing social equality, in which basically we have economies that are based on meeting social needs, meeting things like healthcare and education, and that we also consider what we're doing to the environment with ongoing economic expansion. Climate change is an obvious example of that, but there are many other forms of environmental degradation. So I think we need to think about an alternative global system. I don't say I have all the answers, although I've written about some of these things, that is environmentally sustainable. And I'm not really sure whether the system that has created the problem can solve the problem. Anyway, perhaps the panelists can comment on my rather broad observations.
Well, thank you very much. Let's start with a non-economist. Pradeep, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think, yes, I agree that China's economic growth story of the last 30 years has had serious environmental consequences. But having said that, I think China is also one developing country which is investing heavily in trying to deal with that problem. I mean, I'm not suggesting that China is likely to change its economic model, but at the same time, China is investing in trying to deal with some of the problems that have been created over the past 30 years. And when it comes to new technologies, I think earlier this morning's session, Antonia mentioned that China is now exporting solar technology to Australia. And there is a great deal of support to alternative technologies in China. The Chinese actually have a target, I think 20% of alternative technologies or renewable technologies. Now, I'm not sure whether that includes nuclear energy or not, but they talk about a 20% target of renewable energy. So also, I think, given the way the Chinese political system is structured, if the Chinese government takes initiative to deal with the environmental consequences of economic growth, it has the capacity, better than most other developing countries, to actually implement those policies. And I'm quite encouraged by the approach that the Chinese government is taking to dealing with environmental challenges. It doesn't mean that it's likely to change its economic model, so you'll be disappointed there. But where it can address those challenges, I think there is a great deal of initiative and interest in dealing with those.
Thank you, Pradeep. There's a question down just here, gentlemen.
Just quickly on that one, interestingly, China is one of the few countries that has attempted to try to publish green GDP data. And economists have known for some time that GDP is problematic as a measure of welfare. For 150 years we've known that. But the problem is finding something else as a measure of social welfare, which you were talking about. Green GDP has been one of many proposed alternatives to GDP. And China, the Philippines, a couple of other countries in our region have done quite a bit of work on producing that data. And I agree with Pradeep. I think I'm cautiously optimistic about China's approach in terms of dealing with environmental degradation.
Thanks, Mark. Sir.
Emeritus Professor Grichting. China has a reputation of utter disrespect for intellectual property and for poor funding of research and development. Remedying these problems might reduce the savings bubble. Mr. Eslake, perhaps you could help us out of how the international world might help China to meet its obligation with regard to intellectual property and research and development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Saul.
My understanding of the way that Chinese respond to that issue when it's raised with them is to make the observation that when it had similar standards of national income, the United States was not notable for the way in which it respected intellectual property, and that as recently as 30 years ago, neither were the Swiss in particular. And right, yes, I thought you might have been.
That's why he used the example. I think you'll find.
So, the Swiss were not noted for the way in which they respected intellectual property either. And I think, this is an issue in some ways, as is the issue about the expectations the rest of the world has of China, that they will, from where they are, sacrifice their aspirations to the same living standards that the West has, which they see as making a disproportionate sacrifice or a double standard. So, I think China is going to take the view that they're not going to be pushed around by what they regard, remember, they regard, as Western notions of intellectual property. And I think, we think from our value set that is wrong and unfair, but we're not in a strong position to insist that they do something differently, and they know that.
Yes,
so
stop us.
I think this is just something that we are going to have to work around in the same way as, if I can pick up something Mark said in his presentation, we in our country and in most other Western countries don't like the idea of state-owned enterprises operating in such a large segment of the economy and the kind of close political affiliations between the management of SOEs and the ruling party. I mean, even when state-owned enterprises have played a big role in Australia's economic development, as they have done in the past, there's not been the kind of fluidity between, for example, being chairman of the SEC and being a minister in the state government or something like that as there is in China. And so we can take a view in Australia that, you know, while Chinese companies operate like that, we're going to impose certain restrictions on what they're allowed to do in Australia. But in the end, the Chinese are going to say, well, OK, if that's the view you want to take, we're just not going to invest here and we won't buy as much from you. And there's not much we can do to change their view about these sort of things. And, you know, I think that's the same view that, you know, yes, I wish it were otherwise. But, you know, we are neither in a position to, nor do we really have the moral right to, tell the Chinese how they should organise themselves in that regard.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. One of the comparisons that are made between China and Vietnam, both of which are amusingly called market Leninist states and no longer Marxist-Leninist states, is that the Chinese have successfully divested themselves to a large degree of state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and also rid the military out of the economic sphere, whereas Vietnam has yet to tackle those two issues. Is that true or not true? I don't expect you to comment about Vietnam, but is it true in China?
Pardon?
Well, see, first of all, if you look at, I mean, you're saying that China has divested of state-owned companies. There actually hasn't been a great deal of privatization in China. You know, all the major sectors of China's economy are still controlled by the state. They have corporatized them. They have, you know, they have created stock exchanges in Shanghai and Shenzhen, and many of these companies are now listed on those stock exchanges, but the state is still the biggest shareholder of most of these companies. So all the critical sectors are controlled by the Chinese government. As for the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, in the 1980s, if you look at why the PLA got into business, it was because in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping was saying that we'll cut your budget because we need to focus in other areas. So in the 1980s, as the defense budget was being cut, the PLA were being forced to look into alternative means of generating revenue. But then, obviously, it led to a great deal of corruption. PLA became involved in all sorts of business activities, and it was competing with other state-owned enterprises. And that's when Jiang Zemin decided that there will be a deal with the PLA. PLA budget will be increased considerably, but at the same time, PLA would be forced to quit, you know, indulging in business activities. So now we've seen the PLA's official defense budget increase by 17 to 18% a year. But at the same time, PLA has been forced out of most of the businesses that they control. As for Vietnam, I think is, in terms of policy innovation, Vietnam is still lagging far behind China. And there doesn't seem to be any great deal of desire to follow China in the model either. I'm not a Vietnam expert, so I don't really know, what sort of internal party debates are going on within Vietnam. But clearly, they're not, closely following the Chinese model.
Any comments from any other panelist on that particular?
Yeah, no, that's right. I think with the state-owned enterprises, I mean, they have tried to increase the circulation of shares that were to reduce government ownership and things like that, but they've been very unsuccessful so far. So the stock market is still relatively illiquid, relatively underdeveloped. So again, it's one of these problems that I think the government knows needs to be addressed, but at the moment, particularly with the financial crisis, it's not going to be addressed very quickly.
Well, just to that point, I wanted to ask this question myself before. Given, Pradeep, your point about the growing integration of the political and business elite, and now the point we've just been making about the government owning the SOEs and holding all the shares and so forth, to come to Saul's point about being able to take the retained earnings out of those companies and spend them, I mean, what's stopping the government doing that? It owns them. It owns them in a sort of grander political sense than just a narrow legal sense. Why can't this be instituted by the government without any major change?
Well, in the industry that Saul's most interested in the banking industry, I mean, the structure is foreign banks, for example, can own foreign banks in total can own up to 25% of any one bank. No one foreign bank can own more than 20% of any bank. So you take the big banks and say 25% will be owned and ANZ may pick up RBS's share of existing share of one of the big Chinese banks. He's not winking.
Is hopeful.
But that share won't change anytime soon, and the total amount of shares listed, the shares that aren't owned by foreign participants, is then very small. The rest is owned by a holding company, which is a government company.
But to Saul's point about getting savings out of the SOEs
but these smaller shareholders do have board seats. There is some
so you're saying they can block it?
There is,
it's not only that.
Governance and transparency.
I think there are two other reasons as well. One is that in some cases the SOEs are themselves sources of political power. Right. You know, that is the people who are bosses of steel companies, and that they have political power themselves. I mean, if you want an Australian example, the way, or one that I know a bit about, the way in which the Hydroelectric Commission in Tasmania was in some ways more powerful than the Tasmanian government. Now
really,
not now, but
not that you're on the board.
But 25, 50 years ago, and in that sense, you would be saying, the government might be saying to a set of politically powerful people, we're going to take some money off you. Well, that doesn't happen quite as smoothly as you might imagine in a theoretician's policy prescription manual. The second thing is that it's not necessarily the case that the Chinese authorities themselves, the State Council and others, actually want to erect a sort of comprehensive social security net. In other words, there is a part of, the long-standing, predating the Communist Party, value set which says individuals saving a lot of their income and accepting responsibility for the care of their parents
and
their healthcare and all that sort of thing is, an intrinsic part of the Chinese value system. And what I and other economists, I'm not by no means the original proponent of this, but what has been proposed as a way of neatly solving a number of problems is very much a Western suggestion, which is never going to be automatically accepted by the leadership of a country like China.
Sure, that makes
sense. I think another reason might be, if I can just click on that, is that in some sectors of the economy, which are dominated by state-owned companies, there is no full operation of market forces. Take oil and gas. Now, oil prices are controlled by the party, controlled by the government. And if you ask Chinese, oil and gas companies, which were originally part of the Ministry of Petroleum, they are going to say, okay, if you're going to, if you want that, then obviously there has to be introduction of market forces, allow us to set the market price of petrol.
Right. Yeah, I've got time for one last question. The gentleman in the middle.
Just wondering how evil private savings really are.
I don't know that evil's quite the word, but in respect of our capacity to adjust.
Could I ask the question to flesh that out a bit more?
Yeah.
Well, you're talking about the Chinese household saving too much money.
It's relative.
Yeah, I mean, what I said there, and I was trying to address it specifically when I was up at the podium, is that although Chinese save by Asian as well as by Western standards a relatively large proportion of their disposable income,
like
40% or so, right?
More. Okay.
Or more, that household incomes themselves are a relatively small proportion of GDP, that is of total national income, again by Asian as well as by Western standards, and that the problem of overall excess saving, that is behind China's excessive current account surpluses, is actually not excessive household saving in the grand scheme of things, but excess saving in the corporate sector, predominantly, given the nature of the corporate sector, in Chinese SOEs. And I guess what I'm arguing, trying as I always do when talking about China, is to see the problem from the Chinese perspective, not from a Western or outsider's perspective, but from the Chinese perspective. The problems I see with that are that since SOEs are in turn responsible for a great deal of the investment within China, that investment is subject to no scrutiny or discipline other than the whims of the executives of the SOEs. They are not subject to any discipline that might be imposed by a bond market or a share market, because they would have to raise capital from either of those. They are not subject to any discipline by a bank, which might lend them the money as per the Japanese model, traditionally. And finally, nor are they subject to any discipline from a Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Economic Development that might say, yes, you can have this money for investment because it suits the overall national economic plan. And I think, again, looking at it from a purely Chinese perspective, that the result of having no discipline of any sort at all over the allocation of much of the capital that is accumulated within the Chinese economy is a pattern of overinvestment in total, and within that overinvestment, investment in what is quite often not the right thing, including, if you like, to pick up the point that was made by one of the questioners earlier, including investment in things that actually add to the consumption of coal and add to environmental damage,
Yes.
Compared with the decisions that might be made if they were subject not necessarily to market disciplines through a bond market or a share market, but even to policy disciplines as applied through a Ministry of Economic Planning or something like that.
Mentioning banks and lending discipline in the same sentence. Very brave of you, Saul, I'd have to say.
Well, that's why I said posited some other alternatives.
A comment very briefly in wrapping up, Mark, either to that issue or anything else you'd like to say in closing?
I've only got a very long answer to that one.
A long answer to that. All right, we'll leave it at that.
One off.
Pradeep.
No, unless there's a question.
No, I think that's fine. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for participating in this afternoon's session. Would you join me in thanking our three panellists, Pradeep Kanaja, Saul Eslake and Mark Crosby. Thank you once again for being a part of this afternoon's session. I trust, like me, that you've enjoyed it. Good afternoon.